There is a woman you have never heard of. Not because she did not matter, not because the evidence for her is thin or disputed or buried in some obscure manuscript that took centuries to find. Her name is in one of the most widely read documents in the history of Western civilization. It has been there the whole time, in plain sight, in a chapter that most people skip. Her name is Phoebe. I want to be honest about something before we go any further. I came to this story the way most people come to it, knowing the big names, the big letters, the big arguments. Peter, Paul, Augustine, Luther, the theology of Romans, the drama of Acts. I thought I knew the shape of the story, and then I started reading more slowly, and the shape changed. That is what this film is about. Not a discovery made by scholars in a laboratory somewhere. A discovery that happens when you read the same texts you have always had access to, but read them differently. Read them as if the names in the margins matter as much as the arguments in the center. Phoebe carried a letter. Not just any letter. The letter that Augustine read in a garden in Milan in the summer of 386, and walked out of that garden a changed man. The letter that Martin Luther read in a monastery in Wittenberg in 1513 and could not stop thinking about until the world he lived in broke open. The letter that more theologians, philosophers, and ordinary believers have turned to in moments of crisis than perhaps any other document in the Christian tradition. The letter we call Romans. Phoebe carried it from the port city of Cenchreae, on the eastern coast of Corinth, to Rome. She walked into a community of early Christians who had never met the man who wrote it. And according to how letter-bearing worked in the ancient world, she did not simply hand it over and leave. She read it. She explained it. She answered their questions about what it meant. The first person to interpret the most theologically dense letter Paul ever wrote may have been a woman standing in someone's home in Rome, unrolling a scroll and beginning to speak. So why have most of us never heard her name? That is not a simple question. And the answer is not simple either. It is not a story of one dramatic act of erasure. It is something quieter, and in some ways more unsettling than that. It is the story of names that stayed in the text while the people reading them slowly learned to see those names as smaller than they were. Phoebe is not alone in this story. There is Mary, who stood at a tomb before anyone else did and was trusted to carry the news of what she found there. There is Priscilla, whose name appears before her husband's in text after text, in a world where that simply was not done without reason. There is Junia, whose name was changed, not in the original manuscript, but in the minds of readers who found what that name implied increasingly difficult to accept. There is Lydia, who opened her home and in doing so gave an entire city its first Christian community. There is Thecla, who does not appear in the New Testament at all, but whose story was copied and read and loved by early Christians for centuries because it showed them something they needed to see. These women were not on the margins of early Christianity. They were at the points where the movement needed someone most, and their names are still in the sources. The question this film is going to follow is not whether they existed. That question has already been answered by the texts themselves. The question is this: they were not gone. Their names were still there. So why did later generations learn to read past them? This is harder than it sounds. Most of us have been reading this story through images we did not choose. They were given to us before we had the tools to question them. Paintings seen before we could read. sermons heard before we knew what to do with them. Setting those images aside requires a kind of deliberate effort that feels almost unnatural. But it is necessary, because what the text actually says and what most people carry as memory of the text are not always the same thing. Start with what the text actually says. Not the painting, not the stained glass window, not the image that 2,000 years of Western art have placed so firmly in the imagination that most people carry it as memory, even if they have never set foot inside a church. Start with the document itself. Read carefully, in the order the words appear, with attention paid to what is actually on the page. Because here is something that does not get said often enough. In all four Gospels, the first person at the tomb on the morning of the resurrection is a woman. Not Peter, not John, not any of the 12 disciples, whose names appear most frequently in the tradition that followed. In 3 of the 4 accounts, she is part of a group of women. In the Gospel of John, she comes alone, in the dark, before sunrise. But in every single account we have of that morning, her name appears first. Mary Magdalene. That is not a minor detail. In the world of first-century Jewish memory, the person who arrives first, who witnesses first, who is trusted to carry the news of what they have seen, holds a specific and recognized role. They are not a footnote. They are the witness. And in a legal and cultural tradition that took the reliability of testimony very seriously, being named as the primary witness to the central event of a movement was not a small thing. It was everything. The Gospel of John renders her arrival with a precision that becomes more powerful the more slowly you read it. She comes to the Sahazd while it is still dark. She sees the stone has been moved. She runs to tell Peter and the other disciple. They come. They look inside. And then the text says something quietly extraordinary. It says they went back to their homes. Mary stayed. She stood outside the tomb weeping, and when she looked inside and then turned around, she did not recognize the figure standing near her until he spoke her name. That moment, a person recognized by the sound of their own name spoken in the dark, is one of the most intimate scenes in all 4 Gospels. And the person at the center of it is not Peter. It is not John. It is the woman who stayed when the others went home. Then Jesus gives her an instruction. Go and tell my brothers. That is a commission, a specific task given to a specific person at the most significant moment in the narrative. She is not asked to wait. She is not told to find Peter, so Peter can deliver the message. She is sent directly, with a message that the entire future of the movement depends on being heard. The early church had a phrase for this role. Some scholars have called her the apostle to the apostles, the one sent to the ones who would be sent. It is not a title invented by modern scholars trying to elevate her status. It is a description of what the text of John actually shows her doing. Now here is where the story gets complicated. I find this part genuinely difficult to write. Not because the history is unclear. It is actually quite clear, once you look at it directly, but because the image of Mary Magdalene that most of us carry is not something we chose. It was given to us by paintings we saw before we could read, by sermons we heard before we had the tools to question them. Setting it aside requires a kind of deliberate effort that feels almost disloyal to something, even when you know the something is not quite right. But try, because the Mary Magdalene that most people in the Western world carry in their imagination is not that woman. She is someone else entirely. She is the woman with the alabaster jar of perfume, weeping at the feet of Jesus, drying them with her hair. She is the penitent, the sinner, the woman the tradition has described for centuries as a prostitute redeemed by grace, her past defined by what she was before she encountered Jesus, her significance located entirely in the drama of her forgiveness. That image is powerful. It has produced some of the most extraordinary art in Western history. But there is a problem with it that most people are never told. It is not in the Gospels. The woman with the alabaster jar in Luke chapter 7 is not named Mary Magdalene. She is described only as a woman who was a sinner. The woman who anoints Jesus in the other Gospel accounts is Mary of Bethany, the sister of Martha and Lazarus. And Mary Magdalene, the woman who is actually named in all four Gospels, is introduced with a specific piece of information about her past. She had 7 demons cast out of her. That is all the text says. Not prostitution, not sexual sin, a healing, a deliverance from something the first century called demonic affliction, which could cover a range of conditions the ancient world did not have other language for. 3 different women, 3 different stories, and at some point in the transmission of the tradition, they were folded into one. The moment that crystallized this fusion in the Western imagination happened in the year 591. A bishop of Rome named Gregory delivered a sermon in which he read these 3 women as one woman. He was not the first to suggest the connection, but he was the most authoritative voice to state it plainly. And his authority meant that his reading became the reading for much of Western Christianity for the next 14 centuries. Gregory was not lying. He was not engaged in a conspiracy to diminish a powerful woman. He was a serious theologian working within the interpretive habits of his time, reading the Gospels through assumptions about women and sin and redemption that his world had given him. The fusion he created in that sermon made a kind of moral and theological sense within the framework he was working in. But the result was that the woman who stood at the tomb in the dark, who stayed when the others went home, who was commissioned to carry the most important news in the history of the movement, became famous for something the Gospels never said about her. She became famous for her sin instead of her witness. And something shifted in how she was remembered. Not erased, remembered differently. The name stayed. The presence at the tomb stayed. But the weight of that presence, the specific gravity of what it meant to be the first witness, the one sent to the ones who would be sent, that weight was carried by a different story, a story of forgiveness, of a dramatic past redeemed, of a woman defined by what she had been before Jesus found her. That story is not without beauty, but it is not the story the text tells. In 1969, the Catholic Church officially revised this identification. Gregory's fusion of the 3 women was acknowledged as a conflation, not a historical fact. Mary Magdalene was formally distinguished from the unnamed sinner of Luke and from Mary of Bethany. The revision came 14 centuries after the sermon. Now here is the question that this chapter is really about. Not the question of who Mary Magdalene was. That question has a fairly clear answer in the text itself. The question that matters for what follows is this. If this could happen to Mary Magdalene, the most famous woman in early Christian memory, the woman whose name appears in all 4 Gospels, whose role at the tomb is described in specific and detailed language, whose commission to go and tell is one of the most direct moments of delegation in the entire resurrection narrative. If even she could be remembered through a story the Gospels themselves do not quite tell, then what happened to the women who were less famous? The ones whose names appear in a single chapter that most readers skip. The ones who opened their homes and funded the movement and carried the letters and taught the teachers. The ones who were there all along, in the text, waiting for someone to read slowly enough to notice them. That is where we are going next. Picture the city of Philippi in the year 49 or 50. Not the Philippi of ruins and tourist photographs. The living city, a Roman colonial settlement in northern Macedonia, built on the logic of empire, organized around the rhythms of Roman civic life, temples to Roman gods on the main streets, a marketplace where social status determined where you stood and who acknowledged you, a world in which religion was not a private matter between a person and their conscience, but a public performance woven into every transaction, every civic occasion, every meal shared between people who understood what the sharing meant. Into this city comes a small group of travelers: Paul, Silas, Timothy, Luke. Possibly, they have no letter of introduction to the civic authorities. They have no building. They have no institutional standing of any kind. What they have is a message they cannot stop talking about, and the need for somewhere to stand while they talk about it. They find a place by the river. A group of women has gathered there on the Sabbath for prayer. It is a detail that Acts records without drama, without any sense that what is about to happen is unusual. Paul sits down and speaks to the women who have gathered. One of them is listening more closely than the others. Her name is Lydia. Acts tells us 3 things about her immediately, and each of those 3 things matters more than it might seem at first. She is from Thyatira, a city in the region of Asia Minor known for its textile trade. She is a dealer in purple cloth, and she is described as a worshipper of God, which in the language of Acts typically means a Gentile who had attached herself to the Jewish synagogue community without formally converting. Take the purple cloth for a moment, because that detail is not decorative. Purple dye in the ancient world was extraordinarily expensive. It was extracted from sea snails in a process so labor-intensive and so pungent that the facilities for producing it were typically located far downwind of cities. The finished product was so costly that purple cloth was effectively restricted to the very wealthy, to the imperial household, to the kinds of people who needed to signal their status through the color of what they wore. A dealer in purple cloth in a Roman colonial city was not a market vendor selling affordable goods. She was a businesswoman operating at the high end of a luxury trade, with the connections, the capital, and the social networks that implied. Lydia hears Paul speak, and the text of Acts says something interesting about what happens next. It says the Lord opened her heart to pay attention to what was said. That is the interior moment. But what follows is exterior and practical and consequential in ways that go far beyond the personal. She is baptized. Her household is baptized with her. And then she makes a request that is not quite a request. She says, "If you have judged me to be faithful to the Lord, come to my house and stay." That conditional is doing a lot of work. She is not simply offering hospitality. She is staking her own status as a faithful believer on their acceptance of her offer. If they believe, she is genuinely part of this community. They will come. And Acts records that they came. The church at Philippi, the community to which Paul would later write one of his warmest and most personal letters, began in Lydia's home. Not in a building dedicated to that purpose, not in an institution with a name above the door, in a home, in the space that Lydia controlled, funded, and opened, in the network of relationships that her position as a businesswoman of means had given her access to. This is the detail that changes everything about how we read early Christian history, and it is a detail that most modern readers miss. Not because it is hidden, but because we bring the wrong set of assumptions to the text. When most people in the 21st century hear the word church, they picture a building, a dedicated space, pews or chairs arranged to face a platform, a person with authority standing at the front, the rest of the congregation arranged behind them in a spatial relationship that encodes a social relationship. The person at the front speaks. The people behind listen. Authority flows in one direction. That picture did not exist in the first century. There were no church buildings for the first 200 years of the movement. Possibly longer. The earliest dedicated Christian worship spaces we have archaeological evidence for date to the early 3rd century at the absolute earliest. Before that, for the entire period covered by the New Testament, and for generations after, the movement met in homes. The Greek word is oikos. It means household, but in the world of the 1st century, an oikos was not simply a family living under one roof. It was an economic and social unit. It included the nuclear family, extended family, slaves, freed persons who had been released from slavery but maintained ties to the household, business partners, clients, and dependents of various kinds. The person who headed the oikos was not just the owner of a house. They were the center of a web of obligation, loyalty, economic relationship, and social connection that extended outward from their front door into the city around them. To open your oikos to a new religious movement was not a small act of personal piety. It was a commitment of resources, social capital, and personal risk. If the movement attracted the wrong kind of attention from Roman authorities, the person whose house it met in was the person whose name appeared on the property records, the person who could be held responsible, and in city after city, in the earliest decades of the movement, the person who made that commitment was, with remarkable frequency, a woman. Acts chapter 12 gives us Mary, the mother of John Mark, whose home in Jerusalem becomes a gathering point for the community in a moment of crisis. Peter has been arrested. James has been executed. The community does not scatter. They go to Mary's house and they pray through the night. When Peter escapes and comes to them, he goes directly to her house. He knows that is where they will be. Her house is the place the community runs to when everything is falling apart. That is not a footnote in the story. That is infrastructure. Colossians chapter 4 verse 15 gives us Nympha and the church that meets in her house in Laodicea. One sentence. No elaboration. No explanation of how she came to lead a community or what that leadership looked like in practice. Just the fact of it, stated as though it needed no defense. Because in the world Paul was writing in, it apparently did not. These women, Lydia, Mary, Nympha, were not hosting a book club in a spare room. They were providing the only institutional home that early Christianity had. Their houses were the buildings. Their tables were the altars. Their networks were the infrastructure through which the movement communicated, organized, funded itself, and survived. And here is the thing about power that the first century understood, and the 21st century tends to forget. Power is not only what happens on a stage. Power is also who controls the room where people gather, who decides who is welcome and who is not, who has the resources to keep the community fed and sheltered and protected, who has the social connections to warn the community when danger is coming, and the standing to appeal to the authorities when it arrives. In a movement without buildings, without a central institution, without the kind of formal structure that produces job titles and lines of authority that everyone can see and measure, that kind of power was real power. It was the power that kept communities alive through persecution, through poverty, through the slow, dangerous work of building something new in a world that had not asked for it and was not always glad to have it. The women who opened their homes were not standing at the side of the story. They were holding the story up. And if that is what was happening in Philippi and Jerusalem and Laodicea, cities that Acts and the letters happen to mention, it is reasonable to ask what was happening in every other city where these letters were being received and read and passed along. In every other gathering of 20 or 30 people who met weekly in a space that someone had to provide, someone was providing it. And the names of most of those people are not in the text, but some of them are. And they are in a chapter of a letter that most people treat as administrative filler, as the part you skip to get back to the theology. That chapter is where we are going next. Most people who have read the letter of Romans have a memory of it that goes something like this. Chapters 1 through 11 dense, extraordinary, theologically rich. The arguments about sin and grace and faith and justification that shaped Augustine and Luther and Calvin and every major tradition in Western Christianity. The chapters that get memorized, preached, argued over, and returned to in moments of personal and theological crisis. The chapters that made Romans famous. Chapters 12 through 15, practical application, how to live, how to treat one another. The famous passage about being transformed by the renewing of your mind. Still important, still widely read. Chapter 16, a list of names. People to greet, personal messages, administrative business. The kind of thing you find at the end of a long email from someone who has a lot to say before they get to the logistics. Most readers either skim it quickly or skip it entirely. It feels like the appendix. It feels like the part that does not matter. That instinct is exactly wrong. Chapter 16 of Romans is one of the most valuable documents we have for understanding what early Christianity actually looked like on the ground. Not as theology, not as doctrine, but as a living, breathing network of real people doing real things in a real city in the middle of the first century. Think about what it is. Concretely, Paul is writing to a community in Rome that he has never visited. He has never met most of these people. He is about to send them the most complex and theologically demanding letter he has ever written. And he needs them to receive it well. He needs them to trust it. He needs them to understand that the person sending it is not a stranger, but someone embedded in a network that connects to them. So he does something very deliberate. He names the people he knows in Rome. He names them specifically, with specific descriptions of who they are and what they have done and how they relate to the community. He is drawing a map of his network for people who need to see that he has one. And when you read that map slowly, something becomes visible that fast reading obscures entirely. Paul greets 27 people by name in chapter 16. Of those 27, at least 10 are women. That is more than a third. And the language Paul uses to describe what these women have done is not the language of passive support or quiet assistance. It is the same language he uses throughout his letters to describe the active, difficult, essential work of building and sustaining Christian communities. Start at the beginning of the chapter, because the beginning is where Paul places the person he considers most important. Before he greets anyone, before he names a single person in Rome, he introduces someone. I commend to you our sister Phoebe, a deacon of the church at Cenchreae. We are going to return to Phoebe in detail later, because her story deserves the full attention it has rarely been given. For now, hold the fact that she is the first name in this chapter, not a greeting, an introduction. Paul is telling the Roman community who she is before he tells them anything else, because she is the one bringing this letter, and he needs them to know how to receive her. Then the greetings begin. Greet Prisca and Aquila, my fellow workers in Christ Jesus, who risked their necks for my life, to whom not only I give thanks, but all the churches of the Gentiles give thanks as well. Prisca, her name appears before her husband's, in a world where the social default was to name the man first and the woman second, where inverting that order was the kind of thing that made people notice. Paul puts her name first, and he does it not once but consistently. In 4 of the 6 times this couple is mentioned in the New Testament, Prisca comes before Aquila. Luke, writing Acts, sometimes reverses the order. Paul, who knew them personally, almost never does. That tells you something about her, about how Paul understood their partnership, about what he thought his readers needed to know when they heard the name of this household. He also says they risked their necks for his life. That is not a figure of speech. In the world of the Roman Empire, where Paul's activity regularly attracted the dangerous attention of both Jewish authorities and Roman officials, people who sheltered him, traveled with him, and publicly identified with his work were taking on real personal risk. Prisca and Aquila had done something that put their physical safety on the line for him. He does not say Aquila risked his neck. He says Prisca and Aquila. Continue down the list. Greet Mary, who has worked hard for you. The Greek word Paul uses here is kopao. It means to labor strenuously, to work to the point of exhaustion. It is a strong word. Paul uses it elsewhere in his letters to describe his own missionary work and the work of other key figures in the movement. When he says, Mary has worked hard for you, he is placing her in the same category of language he uses for people who are doing the central, costly, demanding work of building the community. Greet Tryphena and Tryphosa, workers in the Lord. 2 women, possibly sisters, given how closely their names track each other. Workers in the Lord, same category, same language of active labor. Greet the beloved Persis, who has worked hard in the Lord. Persis, Paul calls her beloved. That word in his letters is not used casually, and she has worked hard. Again the same word. Greet Junia. We are going to stop there, because Junia gets her own chapter. What happened to her name over the following centuries is the most precise and most revealing example in the entire New Testament of how a reading can change without the text changing. Her story is the turning point of this film, and it deserves space. But before we get to Junior, stay in chapter 16 for a moment longer. There is Julia. There is the sister of Nereus. There are women mentioned in passing whose specific roles are not described, but whose presence in the network is clearly important enough to Paul that he names them when he is trying to persuade a community he has never met to trust his letter and to trust the woman who carries it. Now step back and look at the whole chapter as what it actually is: a map, not a theological argument, not a doctrinal statement. A map of human beings in relationship, doing specific things, in a specific city, in a specific decade of a specific century. A map that was accurate enough to Paul's actual network that he could write it from memory, or from the notes he had gathered over years of correspondence and travel, and trust that the people in Rome would recognize the names he was sending. When historians of the early church want to understand what the community at Rome looked like in the year 57, this chapter is one of the primary documents they go to, not as illustration, as evidence. And what the evidence shows is a community in which women are not peripheral. They are present across the entire map, at the center, carrying the letter, in the households where the community gathers, in the networks of travel and connection that link Rome to Corinth to Ephesus and back, in the descriptions of labor that Paul applies to the people he considers essential to the work. There is something else in this chapter that is easy to miss if you are reading quickly. Paul asks the Roman community to help these people, to receive Phoebe in a manner worthy of the saints, to assist her in whatever she may need from you, to greet the others, to honor them. He is writing a letter of recommendation for his network. And in the ancient world, a letter of recommendation carried weight precisely because of who was doing the recommending. Paul is asking the Roman community to extend to these women the same trust and cooperation they would extend to him. That is not the language of someone describing people who are helpful in minor ways. That is the language of someone vouching for colleagues whose work is important enough that he needs to make sure they are treated accordingly. Now ask the question that this chapter is designed to produce. If Romans 16 was written in the year 57, if it has been part of the canonical New Testament since the formation of the canon, if it has been read in churches and translated into dozens of languages and studied by scholars for 20 centuries, then why do most people who know the book of Romans well have almost no idea who Phoebe is? Why does the name Priscilla ring a faint bell at best for most regular churchgoers? Why have Tryphena and Tryphosa and Persis and Julia and the sister of Nereus been reduced to names that even serious students of the New Testament often cannot place? The chapter was not lost. The names were not removed. The descriptions were not altered. Something else happened, and it happened most precisely, most visibly, most documentably, to one name in particular, a name that we need to look at very carefully, because what happened to that name tells us more about how memory works than almost anything else in the entire New Testament. Romans 16, verse 7, one sentence, 20 words in the original Greek. Paul writes it the way he writes most of his greetings in this chapter. Quickly, warmly, with the specific details that tell the reader these are real people he actually knows. Greet Andronicus and Junia, my fellow Jews who have been in prison with me. They are outstanding among the apostles. And they were in Christ before I was. Read it again, slowly this time. Fellow Jews, shared heritage, shared history, shared identity, in a world where those things meant something very specific about who you were and where you came from. In prison with me, not a metaphor, not a rhetorical flourish. Paul spent time in Roman custody more than once. The people who shared that experience with him were not casual acquaintances. They were people who had been in the same dangerous situation, under the same kind of pressure, facing the same kind of consequences. Prison in the first-century Roman world was not a place you ended up by accident. In Christ, before I was. This is the detail that places them in the earliest possible layer of the movement. Paul's own encounter with the risen Jesus happened somewhere between 1 and 3 years after the crucifixion, depending on how you date the chronology. Andronicus and Junia were followers of Jesus before that, which means they were part of the movement in its first months, possibly before the crucifixion itself, possibly among the people who had known Jesus directly. And then the phrase that everything else in this chapter turns on, outstanding among the apostles. Set aside for a moment the enormous question of what that phrase means. Just notice what it says. These two people are described by Paul as outstanding, or distinguished, or well-known. Among the apostles, whatever the precise meaning of that phrase, it is placing them in a category that Paul treats as significant, a category associated with authority, witness, and the foundational work of the early movement. Now, who is Junia? That is the question that 14 centuries of Christian scholarship argued about. And the argument is not really about the Greek. It is about what the reader is willing to see. The name Junia is a perfectly ordinary Latin name. It appears hundreds of times in ancient Roman sources, inscriptions, documents, letters, legal records. It was a common name for women of Roman background or Roman cultural connection. If you were cataloging names in the ancient Mediterranean world, Junia would not stand out in any way. It was simply a name that women had. And in the earliest centuries of Christian interpretation, nobody found anything unusual about it. In Romans 16, John Chrysostom, one of the most influential biblical interpreters of the 4th century, preached on this passage and did not blink at the name. He found the description remarkable, the honor of being named among the apostles. And he said so with obvious admiration. He wrote about Junia in terms that made clear he understood her to be a woman and found no difficulty with what Paul was saying about her. He was not alone. The Greek and Latin interpreters of the early and medieval church who discussed this passage almost uniformly read the name as feminine, Junia, a woman whom Paul described in terms that placed her in the company of the apostles. Then something changed. Not in the text, in the reader. At some point in the medieval period, a different reading began to appear. Not Junia, a woman's name, but Junius, a man's name. When I first encountered this, I sat with it for a while before I could figure out what bothered me most. It was not the mistake itself. Mistakes happen in the history of textual interpretation. What bothered me was how unnecessary it was, because there is a problem with the reasoning behind it that is difficult to overstate. The name Junius, as a masculine name, as an actual name that actual men were given in the ancient world, is extraordinarily difficult to find anywhere. Scholars who have gone looking for it in the vast body of ancient Greek and Latin documents have come back largely empty-handed. The name Junia, as a feminine name, is everywhere. The name Junius, as a masculine name, is for all practical purposes nowhere. This is not a minor textual dispute. This is a case where the manuscript evidence, the name as it appears in the earliest Greek texts of Romans, points in one direction. The attestation of the name in ancient sources outside the New Testament points in the same direction. The interpretation of the name by the earliest readers who commented on it points in the same direction. And yet, for several centuries, many readers and translators found their way to a different conclusion. The question worth sitting with is, why? Not in a conspiratorial sense. Not with the assumption that someone sat down and made a calculated decision to deceive. The history of how Junia became Junius in some medieval and early modern manuscripts and translations is not a story of bad actors. It is a story of something more ordinary and in some ways more troubling. It is a story of a text being read through assumptions that the text itself does not share. By the high medieval period, the idea of a woman being described in terms associated with apostolic authority had become not just theologically uncomfortable, but practically unthinkable for many interpreters. The structures of the Church had developed in ways that made the concept of female apostolic authority seem not merely unusual, but categorically impossible. And when a concept becomes categorically impossible, the texts that seem to support it start to get read differently, not through any single dramatic act of revision, through the slow, quiet, almost invisible process of readers finding interpretations that fit what they already believe is true. When Aegidius of Rome, writing in the 13th century, referred to this figure as male, he was not necessarily aware that he was doing something historically significant. He was doing what readers do when a text seems to conflict with their understanding of how the world works. He found a way to make it fit. And once that reading was in circulation, it had its own momentum. Later readers encountered the masculine interpretation in the work of earlier readers they respected. The masculine reading began to appear in printed editions of the Greek New Testament in the 16th century. From there, it made its way into translations. From translations into the understanding of ordinary readers who had no access to the original Greek and no reason to doubt what the translations said. The name Junia became Junius in many of the Bibles that shaped the modern Western world. And with the change of a single letter, a woman described by Paul as outstanding among the apostles became a man whose name appeared nowhere else in the ancient world. Now here is where the story turns again. Because the 20th century brought something the medieval period did not have. It brought rigorous historical linguistics, systematic cataloging of ancient names, and a generation of scholars who were willing to go back to the original sources without the inherited assumptions about what they were allowed to find. What they found was what the earliest interpreters had always seen: Junia, a woman, a name so common in the ancient world that its presence in Romans requires no special explanation. A woman whom Paul knew personally, had been imprisoned with, and described with language that placed her among the foundational figures of the early movement. By the end of the 20th century, most major critical editions of the Greek New Testament had returned to the feminine reading. Most modern scholarly translations followed. The name Junior came back. But the centuries in between had done their work. A generation of believers who grew up with Bibles that said juniors did not know there was a question. A generation of preachers who preached from those Bibles did not know there was a question. The church in those centuries was not hiding something. It was reading the Bible it had been given, with the understanding it had inherited. And that understanding had quietly, incrementally, without drama or announcement, made a woman into a man. The text never changed. The reader changed. And when the reader changed, what the reader saw changed with them. That is the most important thing to understand about what happened to Junior. Not that someone erased her. Not that there was a decision made in some back room to suppress the evidence. The evidence was there the whole time. In the Greek text, in the early commentaries, in the ancient documents where the name Junior appeared on tombstones and legal records and personal correspondence throughout the ancient world. What changed was what later readers had been prepared to see as possible. And when possibility contracts, what the text seems to say contracts with it. Junior did not disappear. She was translated away. And the translation was not a lie. It was a reflection of what the translators genuinely believed the text must mean. Given what they genuinely believed the world was allowed to contain, that is not more comforting than a conspiracy. In some ways, it is considerably less. Because a conspiracy requires a villain and a victim and a moment of decision that could in principle have gone differently. What happened to Junior requires none of those things. It requires only that readers bring their assumptions to the text, as all readers do, and that those assumptions be powerful enough to override what the words on the page actually say. We do that, all of us, all the time. The question Junior's story leaves open is not whether it happened. We can document that it happened. The question is what else it might be happening to. In texts we are reading right now, through assumptions we have not yet noticed we are making. That question does not go away when you close the Bible. It stays with you, and it is the question that makes what comes next so important. Because Junior is the most dramatic example of what happened to women in the early Christian sources. But she is not the only example, and the most important example, the one that connects the drama of chapter 16 back to the woman standing at the harbor in Cenchreae with a scroll in her hand, is the one we have been building toward since the first minutes of this film. It is time to go back to Phoebe. Go back to Cenchreae. You have been there before, at the very beginning of this film. A harbor, a woman, a scroll. But you were there then without context, without the map that Romans 16 provides, without the story of Junior and what it reveals about the gap between what the text says and what later readers were prepared to see. You are there now with all of that, and the harbor looks different. Cenchreae was the eastern port of Corinth, sitting on the narrow strip of land that connects mainland Greece to the Peloponnese. Ships moving between the Aegean and the Adriatic passed through it. Merchants, soldiers, travelers, letter carriers, people moving between the eastern and western halves of an empire that ran on the movement of goods and information. It was not a quiet backwater. It was a transit point, a place of arrival and departure, a city permanently in motion. In that city, there was a Christian community, and that community had a leader. Her name was Phoebe. We know this because Paul tells us, not in passing, not as an afterthought tucked into the margins of something more important. He tells us in the first 2 verses of Romans 16, before he greets a single person in Rome, before he says anything else at all. The first thing Paul does in this chapter, the chapter we have been examining as a map of the early Christian network, is introduce Phoebe. I commend to you our sister Phoebe, a deacon of the church at Cenchreae. That word, deacon, in Greek it is diakonos, and it is the word that sits at the center of everything we need to understand about Phoebe. Because what that word meant to Paul when he wrote it, and what later translators decided it meant when they rendered it into Latin and then into English, are not always the same thing. Paul uses diakonos throughout his letters. He uses it to describe himself. He uses it to describe Apollos, the brilliant preacher who appears in Acts 18. He uses it to describe Tychicus, one of his trusted co-workers and letter carriers. He uses it to describe Timothy, his closest associate in ministry. In every one of those cases, when the word is applied to a man, English translations have historically rendered it as minister, or servant of Christ, or occasionally deacon, in the formal sense of a recognized church office. When Paul uses the same word for Phoebe, something different tends to happen. The King James Bible, which shaped the English-speaking Protestant world for 4 centuries, translates diakonos as servant when it applies to Phoebe. Not minister, not deacon, servant, a word that carries a different weight, a different social register, a different set of implications about status and function and authority. Same Greek word, different English word, different picture of who Phoebe was. This is not a marginal translation dispute of interest only to scholars. It is the kind of decision that determines what an ordinary reader sees when they encounter a name. A minister is someone with recognized authority and function in a community. A servant is someone who helps. Those are not the same person. And the person you picture when you hear the name Phoebe depends enormously on which of those words has been placed between you and the Greek text. Now there is a second word. After introducing Phoebe as a diakonos of the church at Cenchreae, Paul continues. He asks the Roman community to receive her in a manner worthy of the saints and to assist her in whatever she may need from you. And then he gives his reason. For she has been a prostatis of many, and of myself as well. Prostatis. This word is even more specific than diakonos, and its social meaning in the first century Greco-Roman world is quite precise. A prostatis was a patron, a protector, someone who used their resources, their social standing, and their access to the systems of power to provide cover and support for people who needed it. In the Roman world, the patron-client relationship was one of the fundamental organizing structures of social life. Patrons protected clients. Clients owed loyalty and gratitude to patrons. The system ran through every level of Roman society, from the emperor down. When Paul calls Phoebe a prostatis of many people, including himself, he is saying something very specific. She had resources. She had social standing. She had the kind of access to the systems of Roman civic life that allowed her to act as a protector for people who needed protecting. Paul himself was among those people. Think about what that means concretely. Paul, the apostle who wrote more of the New Testament than any other single person, is telling a community of believers that a woman named Phoebe had been his patron. that she had extended to him the kind of social and material protection that patrons extended to clients in the Roman world, that he was, in the social grammar of that world, her client. The hierarchy implied by that relationship does not run in the direction that most people would assume if they were picturing the early church through the lens of how later Christianity organized itself. She protected him, not the other way around. Now hold those two words together. Diakonos, prostatis, minister or deacon of her community, patron and protector of Paul and many others. And then ask the question that Paul's introduction of Phoebe is implicitly asking: why is she making this journey to Rome? The most plausible answer, the one that fits everything we know about how letter-carrying worked in the ancient world, is that she is bringing this letter that Paul has entrusted Romans, the most theologically dense and consequential document he ever produced, to a woman he describes in terms that establish her as a recognized leader of her community and a person of means and standing in the broader social world. But there is more to it than the carrying. In the ancient world, when an important letter arrived from a significant sender, the person who carried it was typically expected to do more than hand it over. They were expected to read it aloud to the assembled community. They were expected to explain it, to provide the context that the letter itself could not contain, to answer the questions that arose from hearing it, to represent the sender's intentions and clarify his meaning when the written words were not enough. Letters in antiquity were not self-contained objects that delivered their meaning automatically. They were one part of a communication that also included the living voice of the person who carried them. If Phoebe carried Romans to Rome, and if she functioned in the way that letter carriers in the ancient world typically functioned, then the first person to read the letter of Romans aloud to a Christian community was Phoebe. The first person to explain what Paul meant by justification by faith was Phoebe. The first person to field questions about what Paul was saying in chapter 9 about predestination and election and the fate of Israel was Phoebe. The first voice that the Roman Christians heard interpreting the theological arguments that Augustine and Luther and Calvin and Wesley and every subsequent generation of Western Christianity would spend centuries arguing over was the voice of a woman standing in someone's house in Rome, unrolling a scroll and beginning to speak. I want to be careful about this claim, because it is the kind of claim that is easy to overstate and hard to walk back once you have stated it too confidently. We cannot know with certainty that this is what happened. What I can tell you is that when I first read about how letter-carrying worked in the ancient world, and then went back to Paul's introduction of Phoebe with that context in mind, something shifted. The two verses that most people skip on their way to the greetings suddenly had a weight they had not had before. Not because the verses changed, because I finally had the context to read them. That is a small thing to admit, but it is the honest account of how this works. You read slowly enough. You find the right context, and the text you thought you knew becomes something you are reading for the first time. What we can say is that this was the normal function of letter carriers in the ancient world, that Paul's introduction of Phoebe establishes her as someone with the standing and authority to fulfill that function, and that there is no reason internal to the text to assume she did anything less. The inference is not speculation. It is what the historical context suggests, taken seriously. Now return to the word diakonos, because there is one more layer to the translation question that matters here. When Paul uses diakonos for Phoebe, he specifies something that he does not specify when he uses it for himself or for the male co-workers. He describes with that word. He says she is a diakonos of the church at Cenchreae, a specific community, a recognized role within that community, not just someone who serves in a general sense, someone who holds a recognized position in a specific ecclesial body. This is the closest thing we have in the New Testament to a formal title being applied to a woman in a church context. And for centuries, the translation choice made in rendering that title determined whether readers saw a leader or a helper, an office holder or an assistant, someone whose authority warranted Paul's emphatic introduction, or someone who was simply running an errand. The choice was not neutral. It was never neutral. And it is worth asking, honestly and without accusation, what the reader who chose servant over minister was seeing when they looked at this text. Were they seeing what Paul wrote? Or were they seeing what their assumptions about women and authority and ecclesial function allowed them to see? Both things can be true. The translator can be operating in complete good faith and still be seeing the text through a frame that the text itself does not provide. That is what makes this so important to understand. The distortion does not require bad intent. It requires only that the reader bring assumptions powerful enough to quietly reshape what the words on the page seem to say. Phoebe was not hidden. Her name is the first word in a chapter that has been read in churches for 2,000 years. Her title appears in plain Greek in every manuscript tradition we have. Her role as patron of Paul himself is stated without apology or qualification. She was translated small. And when you translate someone small, you do not need to erase them. You just need readers who have been given no reason to look at them closely. Readers who skim past the administrative chapter to get back to the theology, not knowing that the administrative chapter contains one of the most significant figures in the history of the early movement. Readers who see the word servant and move on, because servant is what they expected to find. There is a final thing to say about Phoebe before we move forward. She made the journey. Whatever the precise content of her role, whatever the full weight of the words Paul used to describe her, she got on a ship at Cenchreae and traveled to Rome, alone, or with a small group. In a world where long-distance travel was difficult and often dangerous, where a woman traveling without a male guardian was operating outside the social norms that the Roman world considered appropriate, where the community she was traveling to had never met her and knew her only through the introduction Paul had written. She went anyway. She arrived. She delivered the letter. She did whatever she was there to do. She assisted the Roman community in the way Paul had asked them to allow her to assist them. And then, at some point, she disappears from the historical record entirely, the way almost everyone in the ancient world disappears. Not because they were unimportant, because the record was never designed to follow people like her all the way to the end of their stories. We have her name. We have 2 verses. We have the most important letter in the history of Western Christianity, which she may have read aloud for the first time to people who had never heard it before. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, more than most people who shaped the world they lived in ever left behind. Her name is Phoebe, and it has been in the text the whole time. There is a temptation, when telling a story like this one, to treat each woman as an isolated case. Mary Magdalene, one remarkable woman, one remarkable morning. Lydia, one remarkable woman, one remarkable household. Phoebe, One remarkable woman, one remarkable journey. The temptation is understandable. It is easier to hold a story when it has a single face, and each of these women is genuinely extraordinary when you look at her closely enough to see what the text actually says about her. But the extraordinary becomes ordinary when you find it everywhere you look. And when you look at the first-century Christian sources with the kind of slow, deliberate attention that Romans 16 demands, what you find is not a handful of exceptional women scattered across an otherwise male landscape. What you find is a network, a web of women moving through the same world, doing the same kinds of work, taking the same kinds of risks, connected to one another and to the men around them by the shared and dangerous project of building something new. Phoebe is not an anomaly. She is the most clearly documented node in a much larger pattern, and the pattern begins with movement. Early Christianity spread the way all ideas spread in the ancient world, not through institutions, not through broadcast systems that could reach many people simultaneously, through individuals moving from place to place, carrying news and letters and personal testimony from one small community to the next. The roads and shipping lanes of the Roman Empire were, in this sense, the infrastructure of the gospel, and the people who used those roads and those ships, who were willing to uproot themselves and travel, were the people through whom the movement grew. Priscilla and Aquila moved constantly. We can track their movements through the New Testament with unusual precision, because they appear in multiple sources written by different authors at different times. They are in Corinth when Paul first meets them. Having recently arrived from Rome after the Emperor Claudius expelled the Jewish community from the city in the year 49, they travel with Paul to Ephesus, where they remain when he continues his journey. They are back in Rome by the time Paul writes Romans, which is where he greets them and describes them as people to whom all the churches of the Gentiles give thanks. All the churches of the Gentiles, not the church at Corinth, not the church at Ephesus, all of them. The language is sweeping and deliberate. Paul is describing a couple whose influence and contribution are recognized not locally, but across the entire network of Gentile Christian communities he has spent his ministry building. And again, Priscilla's name comes first. This is worth pressing on, because it is the kind of detail that is easy to read past when you encounter it once, and easy to recognize as significant when you see the pattern across multiple texts. In a world where the social default was to name the husband before the wife, where inverting that order required a reason, the consistent placement of Priscilla's name before Aquila's is not accidental. It is information. The most straightforward reading of that information is that within the network Paul was part of and writing for, Priscilla was the more prominent figure. Not Aquila, Priscilla, the woman. Now go to Acts 18. Apollos arrives in Ephesus. Acts describes him with language that is clearly meant to convey someone impressive. He is Epilogue. He is learned in the scriptures. He is fervent in spirit. He speaks and teaches accurately about Jesus. He is, by any measure, a significant figure in the early movement. Someone whose preaching is having real impact and who will go on to become important enough that the community at Corinth later divides into factions, aligning themselves with Paul or with Apollos. And he has a gap in his understanding. He knows only the baptism of John. He does not yet have the full picture of what the community has come to believe about Jesus and the Spirit. Priscilla and Aquila hear him speak, and what they do next is the detail that the text records without fanfare. without any suggestion that it is unusual, without any narrative comment about whether this was appropriate or surprising or theologically controversial. They took him aside and explained to him the way of God more accurately. Priscilla and Aquila, in that order, took him aside and explained. This is a teaching scene. A significant teacher, a man of evident learning and skill, is instructed in more accurate theology by a couple in whose household the explanation takes place. And the woman's name comes first. The text does not explain why Priscilla's name comes first. It does not pause to tell us that she was the primary teacher and Aquila the secondary one. It simply presents the scene the way it was, in the order that Paul and Luke, writing independently, both found natural. What the scene shows, undeniably, is a woman in the act of theological instruction, not supportive presence, not listening quietly while her husband taught. Instruction, the correction of a learned man's theological understanding by a woman whose name the text places first in the description of that correction. That scene is in Acts, the canonical book of Acts, the book that is part of every Bible in every tradition. It has been there the entire time. Most people who have read Acts have read past it without stopping, because the assumptions they bring to the text do not prepare them to see it as significant. But it is significant, and the woman at the center of it is Priscilla. Now, return to the line in Romans 16 that describes what Priscilla and Aquila did for Paul. They risked their necks for my life. That phrase has a weight that is easy to underestimate when you read it in the comfortable distance of 2,000 years. In the world Paul was operating in, his activity regularly attracted the kind of attention from authorities that ended in imprisonment, flogging, and occasionally death. The people who publicly identified with him, who housed him, who traveled with him, who put their names and addresses on the record as his associates, were taking on genuine personal danger. Priscilla took on that danger. She did it in Corinth, where she and Aquila hosted Paul for 1.5 years. She did it in Ephesus, where the community met in their home and where Paul's ministry generated enough civic disruption that a riot broke out in the theater. She did it in Rome, where the community that Paul writes to in Romans was operating in a city that had already expelled its Jewish population once and would, within a decade, begin persecuting Christians under Nero. The neck she risked was her own, and Paul says that not only he, but all the churches of the Gentiles owe her thanks. Consider what it means that he says that, in a letter designed to introduce himself to a community he has never met, to establish his credentials and his network and his trustworthiness, Paul invokes the name of Priscilla as evidence of his standing. He is saying, in effect, that the woman who comes first in this greeting is someone whose reputation is known across the entire Gentile Christian world, someone whose contribution is so recognized that naming her is itself a form of credentialing. He is borrowing her authority to establish his own. And then there are the women he describes simply as workers. Mary, who has worked hard for you, Tryphena and Tryphosa, workers in the Lord. Persis, who has worked hard in the Lord. These descriptions are brief. They do not come with the biographical detail that Priscilla and Phoebe receive. But the brevity is not diminishment. It is the brevity of someone naming colleagues whose work is known and recognized and does not require extensive explanation. When Paul says a person has worked hard, He is using a word that in his vocabulary carries significant weight. He uses it in 1 Corinthians to describe the labor of the apostles. He uses it in Galatians to describe his own missionary work. He uses it in 1 Thessalonians to describe the kind of effort that warrants recognition and respect within the community. When he says Mary has worked hard for you, he is placing her in the same category of labor as himself and as the apostles, not as someone who helped in minor ways, as someone who did the difficult, exhausting, essential work of building and sustaining the community. We do not know what that work looked like for Mary specifically. We do not know what it looked like for Tryphena and Tryphosa and Persis. The text does not tell us, but the language Paul uses tells us how he evaluated it. And his evaluation is clear. They labored hard in the Lord. That is the summary of a life given to something important. Now pull back and look at what we have been tracing through these sources. Women moving across the empire, connecting communities to one another through travel and personal presence. Women hosting those communities in their homes, providing the only institutional space the movement had. Women teaching, including teaching men of recognized learning and skill. Women taking physical risks, putting themselves in danger for the sake of the work and the people doing it. Women laboring in ways that Paul evaluated with the same language he used for his own apostolic work. This is not a picture of women at the margins of early Christianity. This is a picture of women at the operational center of it, not at the margins, not in the footnotes, not in the supporting roles that later traditions would assign to them when the movement had grown large enough to develop the institutional structures that defined roles more narrowly. At the center, doing the work, taking the risks, building the thing, and most of their names are barely known. Tryphena and Tryphosa have been in Romans 16 for 2,000 years. Most people who have read Paul their entire lives cannot tell you who they are. Persis has been there the same length of time. She is beloved. Paul says, she has worked hard. She is in the text, right there, in a chapter Paul wrote to a community he cared deeply about. Most people have never heard her name. This is the pattern that Junior's story makes visible in its most dramatic form. But that runs through the entire landscape of these early sources. Not erasure, not a single dramatic act of suppression. Just the slow, quiet, cumulative effect of reading these texts through assumptions that made it easy to see the men and easy to read past the women. Easy to stop at chapter 15 of Romans, where the theology is. Easy to skim chapter 16, where the names are. Easy to assume that a list of greetings is administrative background noise rather than a map of the people who actually kept the movement alive. Easy to read the word servant and not wonder whether the Greek said something different. Easy, in other words, to miss what was there the whole time. We have been doing that for a very long time, and the women who were there are still waiting to be seen. Everything we have looked at so far comes from the same kind of source. Letters, the book of Acts, documents that were written within living memory of the events they describe, by authors embedded in the communities they were writing about, preserved and transmitted, because the churches that formed the canon considered them authoritative. When we talk about Phoebe and Priscilla and Junia and Lydia, we are talking about people whose names appear in texts that every major Christian tradition has accepted as scripture for nearly 2,000 years. That is one kind of evidence. It is the most direct kind, and it is enough. on its own to establish that the story most people inherited about women in early Christianity is significantly incomplete. But there is another kind of evidence, and it tells us something that the letters and Acts cannot quite tell us on their own. It tells us what early Christians imagined was possible, not what the historical record can verify happened, what the community of believers in the first and second and third centuries found it natural and powerful and worth preserving to imagine, what they wrote down and copied and read aloud and passed from community to community because the story said something true about who they were and what they believed the world could contain. That kind of evidence does not prove historical events, but it proves something else. It proves the shape of the imagination that early Christianity carried. It proves what that imagination made room for, and it proves that the imagination of early Christianity, in at least some significant communities, made room for a woman who preached, who survived impossible odds, who left behind family and social expectation and the entire structure of Roman domestic life to follow something she believed was more important. Her name is Thecla. She does not appear in the New Testament. She appears in a text called The Acts of Paul and Thecla, written sometime in the 2nd century, circulated widely in the early church, read and copied and discussed by communities from Asia Minor to North Africa to Western Europe to Tertullian, writing in the late 2nd century, mentions it with irritation, which tells us it was influential enough to be worth arguing against. The fact that a serious theologian felt the need to push back against it is itself evidence of how broadly it was read and how seriously it was taken. The story begins in a city called Iconium. Paul arrives and begins to preach. He is staying in the house of a man named Onesiphorus, and through a window or an open wall, a young woman in the house next door can hear him speaking. Her name is Thecla. She is young, engaged to be married to a man named Thamyris, positioned exactly where Roman society expected a woman of her background to be positioned, on the threshold of marriage, of household management, of the domestic life that was not merely expected of her, but legally and socially required. She sits by the window and she listens. For 3 days she does not eat. She does not sleep. She does not move from the window. She is transfixed by what she is hearing. Though the text is careful not to tell us she has yet spoken to Paul or received any direct teaching from him, she is hearing. And what she is hearing is changing something in her that the world around her does not have a category for. Her mother notices. Her fiancé notices. The city notices. And the reaction is not gentle concern. It is fury. Because what Thecla is doing, sitting by a window and refusing to fulfill the social obligations that define her existence, is not a private act of personal piety. It is a public rupture. It is a young woman refusing, through her stillness and her listening, to be what the world has decided she is. Her fiancé brings charges. Paul is arrested. Thecla bribes her way into the prison to sit at his feet and hear more. When this is discovered, her mother calls for her to be burned. The city agrees. A fire is prepared. Thecla is brought to the fire. She is not afraid. The text describes her looking through the crowd and seeing Paul, or someone she takes to be Paul, and she steps toward the fire the way someone steps toward something they have chosen, not something that has been done to them. She makes the sign of the cross. She gets on the pyre. The fire does not touch her. A hailstorm extinguishes it. She walks away. This pattern repeats throughout the story. Thecla faces death multiple times, in multiple cities, through multiple mechanisms. Wild animals in the arena, drowning, fire again. Each time, something intervenes. Each time, she survives. And each time, what sustains her is not rescue from outside, but something in herself. A conviction so settled and so deep that it does not waver when the threat is immediate and the odds are impossible. At some point in the story, Thecla cuts her hair and puts on men's clothing. This detail was enormously significant to ancient readers, not as a statement about gender identity in any modern sense, but as a statement about the life she was choosing. A woman who cut her hair and dressed as a man in the ancient world was making visible her refusal of the social role that her appearance had always signaled. She was saying, in the only language available to her, that she was no longer available to be defined by the expectations that came with being a woman in a Roman city. She follows Paul. She helps him in his work. And then, in a moment that is one of the most striking in the entire text, she baptizes herself in a tank of water where the authorities have placed sea creatures to kill her. Thecla throws herself in with the words, "I baptize myself in the name of Jesus Christ." The creatures die. She emerges. Eventually, she finds Paul again, and she tells him she is going to teach. His response in the text is a form of blessing. He sends her to do it. She goes to Iconium, the city that wanted to burn her. She finds the family of the man who had first welcomed Paul. She teaches them. Then she goes to other cities. She heals. She speaks. She builds community. The text ends with her living to an advanced age, teaching and healing, and then disappearing into the earth, or according to some manuscripts, traveling to Rome. The details varying across the many copies that survive. Now, what do we do with this? The first thing is to be honest about what it is and what it is not. Thecla is not historical evidence in the way that Romans 16 is historical evidence. The Acts of Paul and Thecla is a narrative text, shaped by the conventions of ancient storytelling, full of miraculous elements that most modern readers will not receive as literally true. Written by an author or authors we cannot identify with certainty, about a figure whose historical existence we cannot independently verify. What Thecla is something different from historical evidence, and that different thing is not less valuable. It is valuable in a different way. Thecla is evidence of imagination. She is evidence that in the 2nd century, communities of Christians existed who found it natural to tell a story in which a woman was the central figure of courage, endurance, and active faith. Communities who found it worth writing down and copying and circulating that this woman had baptized herself, had taught publicly, had healed, had refused every social structure that tried to define her, and had done all of this not in defiance of the faith, but as an expression of it. The story was preserved because people loved it, not because it confirmed what they already believed, because it showed them something they needed to see. Susan Hylan, a scholar who has written carefully about Thecla in the context of early Christian history, makes a point that is worth holding on to. The story of Thecla needs to be read in the context of what Roman society expected of women, particularly around the virtues of modesty and chastity. When the story presents Thecla as refusing marriage, it is not simply presenting her as a rebel. It is presenting her as someone who has transferred her absolute devotion from the social institution of marriage to the practice of faith. The story works within the categories of its world, even as it pushes against the specific structures of that world. That is important, because it tells us the story was not intended to be transgressive for its own sake. It was intended to show that complete devotion to faith could look like something, could take a form, that the world around it did not have a category for, and that this was not a failure but a fulfillment. The communities that read and treasured and copied this text were not a fringe. The text was too widely circulated, too persistently copied, too earnestly discussed for it to have been marginal. It was part of the imaginative world of early Christianity in a way that shaped how many believers thought about what faith could require and what women who held that faith could do and be. And then consider what that means alongside everything else we have seen in this film. Phoebe, who was there in Romans 16, described with language Paul used for his most trusted co-workers. Priscilla, who was there in Acts and in 4 of Paul's letters, teaching and leading and risking her life. Junia, who was there in Romans 16, described in language that placed her in the company of the apostles until later readers found that placement uncomfortable. Lydia, who was there in Acts 16, whose household became the first Christian community in an entire city. Mary, Tryphena, Tryphosa, Persis, who were all there in Romans 16, described as laborers in the work of the Lord. And now Thecla, not there in the canon, but there in the imagination of communities who read and loved and copied her story for centuries, who found in her something they needed to believe was possible. Taken together, these sources do not give us a picture of women at the margins of early Christianity. They give us a picture of women at the center of what early Christianity believed it was, what it believed it could do, and what it believed a person fully given to faith could look like. That picture was never entirely lost. It was sitting in the texts the whole time. It just required someone to read slowly enough to see it. And that brings us to the last question this film needs to ask. Not about the first century, about the centuries in between, about what happened between the world where Phoebe carried the letter and the world where most people had never heard her name, about how memory works when a movement grows beyond the world that produced it, and about what we owe to the people that growth left behind. Go back to the beginning, not to century, not to the harbor and the woman with the scroll. Go back further than that. Go back to the question that has been running underneath every chapter of this film. The question we have been circling without ever quite landing on directly. Because the answer is not simple, and anyone who tells you it is simple is not being honest with you. The question is this: how does a person stay in the text and disappear from the story at the same time? Because that is what happened. Not to one woman, to many of them. Phoebe is in Romans 16. She has been there for 2,000 years. Junia is in Romans 16. Priscilla is in Acts and in 4 of Paul's letters. Mary Magdalene is in all 4 Gospels. Named first at the tomb. Commissioned directly by the risen Jesus to carry the news that everything had changed. These are not obscure references in disputed manuscripts. They are in the texts that the Church has read aloud, translated, preached, argued over, and built its entire theological tradition on for 20 centuries. And most people who have spent their lives inside that tradition cannot tell you who Phoebe was. So the question stands, how does that happen? The answer is not a conspiracy. It is not a single decision made by a single powerful person at a single identifiable moment. It is not even, in most cases, conscious intent. What it is something more ordinary and, in the end, more difficult to address than a conspiracy would be. Because a conspiracy can be exposed and condemned and corrected. What actually happened is harder to see, harder to name, and harder to undo. What actually happened is that memory is not a recording. It is a choice. And choices are made by people operating within assumptions. And assumptions are invisible to the people who hold them, precisely because they feel like the obvious truth about how the world works, rather than like choices at all. 3 moments show us this most clearly. Gregory, in the year 591, delivered a sermon in which he read 3 different women from the Gospels as one. He was not inventing things from nothing. He was a serious theologian, working with connections earlier interpreters had suggested, reading through a framework of sin and repentance that made theological sense within his tradition. But he was also reading through assumptions about women and spiritual reliability that his world had given him. Assumptions that made the combination of a woman's prominence in the resurrection narrative and a woman's dramatic past feel like a more complete story than the simpler reading the Gospels themselves support. The witness became the penitent, not because the text required it, because the frame made it feel natural. Junior's name was read as masculine by medieval interpreters, who found the implications of her womanhood in that context categorically unacceptable. Not because the manuscript evidence supported it. The name Junior was everywhere in the ancient world. The name Junius was almost nowhere. But when a concept becomes categorically impossible, texts that seem to support it get read differently. No single dramatic act of revision, just the quiet, almost invisible process of readers finding interpretations that fit what they already believe is true. Phoebe was translated small. The Greek word diakonos, applied to her in Romans 16, was rendered servant in English, while the same word applied to Paul and Apollos, and Timothy became minister or servant of Christ. The Greek did not change. The English changed. And with the change in English, the reader's picture of Phoebe changed with it. What these 3 moments share is the same underlying structure. The texts did not change. The readers changed. And when readers bring assumptions powerful enough to quietly reshape what the words on the page seem to say, the person in the text does not need to be removed. They just need to be seen as smaller than they were. That is the most important thing this film has been trying to say. The women of early Christianity were not lost because someone took them away. They were lost because the people reading about them were given a frame that made them hard to see. A frame so thoroughly internalized, so completely identified with the obvious truth about how the world worked, that the readers who looked through it did not know they were looking through anything. They thought they were simply reading. They thought the servant they saw in the Greek word was the servant that was there. They thought the man they saw in Junior's name was the man that was there. They thought the penitent they saw in Mary Magdalene was the Mary that was there. They were not lying. They were seeing what their frame allowed them to see. And for the women whose names appeared in those texts, the effect was the same, whether the frame was conscious or not. Phoebe carried a letter that shaped Western civilization. Most people who can recite the central arguments of that letter cannot tell you her name. Junia was described by Paul in language that placed her among the foundational figures of the early movement. For several centuries, she was read as a man whose name appears nowhere else in the ancient world. Mary Magdalene stood at the tomb, was commissioned to carry the most important news in the history of the movement, and became famous for a story the Gospels never tell about her. These are not minor footnotes to the history of Christianity. They are evidence of a pattern in which the texts contained one reality and the tradition transmitted another. A pattern in which the gap between those two things was not created by a single dramatic act of suppression, but by the slow, quiet, cumulative work of readers reading through frames they could not see. The question that this film cannot answer, but cannot avoid asking, is what else the frame is hiding. Not in the past. Now, every reader brings assumptions to the text. Every translator brings a frame. Every preacher who decides which names to emphasize and which to move past quickly is making a choice. Usually, without knowing they are making a choice about what the community they serve will be able to see. What assumptions are we bringing right now? What are the names we are reading past because our frame has not prepared us to see them as significant? What is sitting in the text, in plain sight, waiting for someone to read slowly enough to notice it? These are not comfortable questions. They are not meant to be. The history of Phoebe and Junia and Priscilla and Mary is not a comfortable history. It is a history that asks something of the reader, something more than acknowledgement of the past, something that has to do with the present act of reading and what that act does and does not allow us to see. The women of early Christianity were not erased. They were translated small. They were preached past. They were remembered through stories that were not quite theirs. They were given names that belonged to someone else, or had their names given to someone else, or were simply left in a chapter that most people skip on their way back to the theology. But they were never gone. They are still in the text. Phoebe is still in the first 2 verses of Romans 16. Still described with words that Paul used for his most trusted co-workers and his most recognized leaders. Junia is still in Romans 16 verse 7. Still described with language that the earliest readers understood to place her in the company of the apostles. Priscilla is still in Acts 18. Still named before her husband. Still teaching a brilliant man the accurate theology he lacked. Mary Magdalene is still at the tomb in all 4 Gospels, still named first, still commissioned to go and tell. Lydia is still in Acts 16, still opening her home, still making the first Christian community in Philippi possible. Tryphena and Tryphosa and Persis and Mary are still in Romans 16, still described as women who worked hard in the Lord. They have been waiting in the text for the whole of the 2,000 years we have been reading it. The question is not whether they are there. The question is whether we are finally willing to read slowly enough to see them. Say their names. This matters more than it sounds. Names are how memory holds on. And these particular names have a way of slipping, not because they are hard to remember, but because nothing in the way most of us were taught to read these texts prepared us to hold on to them. Not as a list, not as a roll call of historical figures whose significance has been established and whose cases can now be considered closed. Say them the way you say the name of someone you have just met and do not want to forget. The way you repeat a name to yourself after an introduction, because you know that names, if you do not hold on to them deliberately, have a way of slipping away. Phoebe, a woman who traveled alone from a harbor city in Greece to the capital of the Roman Empire, carrying a document that would shape Western civilization for 2,000 years. A woman whose community recognized her as a leader, whose patron relationship with Paul placed her above him in the social grammar of the world they both inhabited, whose name Paul placed first in a chapter designed to establish his credentials with people who had never met him, because her name was worth more to that introduction than almost anyone else he could have mentioned. Her name has been in Romans 16 for 2,000 years. Most people who can quote Romans 8 from memory cannot tell you who carried the letter there. Priscilla, a woman whose name appears before her husband's in text after text, written by authors who knew them both, in a world where that inversion was not accidental and was not done without reason. A woman who taught theology to a brilliant man in a house that was also a church, in a city where the community met around her table and owed its existence in part to her willingness to make her home available for something that put her at risk. A woman who, according to Paul, risked her life for his. Her name has been in Acts and in 4 of Paul's letters for 2,000 years. Most people who know the story of Apollos do not know the name of the woman who corrected his theology. Junia, a woman whose name was changed, not in the original manuscript, in the minds of readers who found what her name implied increasingly difficult to accept. A woman who had been in prison with Paul, who had followed Jesus before Paul did, who was described by Paul with language that the earliest interpreters understood to place her in the company of the apostles. A woman whose name was read as masculine for several centuries, based on a masculine name that appears almost nowhere else in the ancient world, until scholars went back to the manuscripts and the ancient name records and found what had always been there. Her name has been in Romans 16 for 2,000 years. For a significant portion of those 2,000 years, it was read as a man's name, Mary Magdalene, a woman who stood at a tomb before dawn while the men who had followed Jesus went back to their homes. A woman who stayed, a woman who was the first to see, the first to be spoken to, the first to be commissioned with the message that the movement would spend the rest of its history proclaiming. A woman who became famous across 14 centuries of Western art and preaching and imagination, for a story the Gospels themselves never quite tell about her. Her name has been in all 4 Gospels for 2,000 years, and for most of that time, the most famous thing about her was something that was not in any of them. Lydia, a woman of means and network and social, standing in a Roman colonial city, who heard a traveling preacher speak by a river and opened her home to everything that followed. A woman whose household became a church before there were church buildings, whose resources sustained a community that had nothing else to sustain it, whose willingness to take on the risk of hosting a movement that the authorities were not friendly toward made possible the community that Paul would later write to with more warmth than almost any other. Her name has been in Acts for 2,000 years. Most people who know Philippi know it as the city Paul wrote to from prison. Fewer know the name of the woman whose home made the Philippian church possible. Tryphena, Tryphosa, Persis, women who worked hard. That is what Paul says about them. Not that they attended, not that they supported from a distance, that they labored, with the same Greek word he used for his own apostolic work. In the same cause, at the same cost. In a city far from home, that they had made their home because the work required it. Their names have been in Romans 16 for 2,000 years. Most people who have read Romans their entire lives could not place them. And Thecla, not in the canon, not in the text that the Church decided, over centuries of argument and discernment, to gather into what we call the New Testament, but in the imagination of early Christians, in the stories they told about what faith could require of a person and what a person fully given to faith could survive, could do, could become. A woman who sat by a window and listened and was changed by what she heard, and refused, from that moment forward, to be defined by the life the world had prepared for her. Her story was not scripture, but it was loved. It was copied. It was read aloud in communities scattered across the ancient world, because it showed people something they needed to see, that a woman could be the hero of her own story of faith, that the cost of following something you believed was worth more than everything the world said you owed. It did not disqualify you from the company of the faithful, that the courage required to live what you believed was not gendered. These women are not inventions of modern scholarship. They are not figures conjured from thin air by researchers with an agenda. They are in the sources, in the letters Paul wrote in the first century of the Common Era, in the book of Acts, in the texts that circulated among early Christian communities and shaped the imagination of a movement that was still in its first generations, figuring out what it was and what it believed and who it was for. The question that this film has been asking from the beginning is not whether they were there. They were there. The question is why we had to look so carefully to find them. And that question does not have a single, clean answer. It has the answer that the story of Junior's name gives us, which is that assumptions can quietly reshape what a reader sees, without the reader knowing their vision has been altered. It has the answer that the story of Gregory's sermon gives us, which is that authority, even well-intentioned authority, shapes memory in ways that outlast the moment of its exercise by centuries. It has the answer that the story of Phoebe's translation gives us, which is that a single word choice, made by a single person in a single moment, can determine what millions of subsequent readers are able to see in a text they trust. None of those answers require a villain. All of them require honesty. Honesty about the fact that reading is never neutral. That translation is never neutral. That the choice of which names to preach and which to pass by is never neutral. That every generation of readers inherits a frame and looks through it and mistakes the frame for the truth about what the text contains. And honesty about the fact that we are doing it right now, in this generation, with these texts, through frames we have not yet noticed. That is the thing that the women of early Christianity are still asking of us, if we are willing to hear it, not just to acknowledge that they existed, not just to add their names to a list of important historical figures that gets recited and then forgotten, but to do the harder thing, to ask what we are not seeing, to sit with the text slowly enough to notice the names we have been taught to read past, to question the frames we did not choose but have been looking through so long that they have become invisible. The names are still there. Phoebe is still at the beginning of Romans 16. Junior is still in Romans 16 verse 7. Priscilla is still teaching Apollos in Acts 18. Mary is still at the tomb. They have been waiting in the text for the entire 2,000 years we have been reading it. They are waiting still. The only question left is whether we will read slowly enough to see them. And when you go back to Romans 16 after this, because that is where all of this lives, in that chapter, most people skip. In those names, most people cannot place. In that map of a movement that looks like administrative filler until you slow down enough to see what it actually is. Ask yourself one question. Whose name are you reading past? And why?